Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to a brand new episode of Hot Topics. I'm your girl, Gabrielle. Let me tell you what this show is about. So, this is the show where we like to have real discussions about real things. We like to talk about things in education, employment, mental health, physical health. We've done episodes about homeschooling, artificial intelligence, what else? Self care, entrepreneurship, all that mushy gushy stuff, but all with the sole purpose of educating you, and was not a sole purpose, but but with the purpose of you being better than how you were yesterday. And today is no different. I am looking forward to this show because while it is a brand new topic, I have a returning guest. I love it when the guests come back to hot topics. So let me tell you who the guest is, who is back on the hot seat. His name is Sameer Dossani. And I didn't even tell you the name of the show. Sorry. The title of the show today is, it's a long one, so pay attention. Embarking on an animal based diet, a journey of healing from veganism. So I hope you guys caught all that. So that is the topic for today. And my returning guest is Sameer Dossani. So let me just tell you briefly about who he is. So Sameer Dossani is a health and nutrition coach specializing in helping people reverse chronic disease and achieve optimal health and wellness. Beautiful. So he was on my show before, Study Abroad. I believe it's Study Abroad Part 5. So make sure you check out that episode, learn a little bit more about Sameer. But now he is back on the show. So let me go ahead and bring him to the stage. Hi, Sameer. How you doing?
Doing well, Gabrielle, and yourself.
Good, good. Thank you for coming back on and coming back to the hot seat. So today we're going to talk about an interesting topic. I'm curious to see where we're going to go with this. So let me just repeat it again. Embarking on an animal-based diet, a journey of healing from veganism. So what in the world is that? Please tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I don't know where to start, Gabrielle. So in the last discussion, we talked about my sort of journey from Washington D.C. to Canada. I was in Montreal, then I was in Australia, and then India, the Philippines. I've traveled around the world. Currently in South Africa, but at some early point in this journey, so actually the first stop at McGill in Montreal, as I mentioned, I got attracted to a certain kind of leftist politics. And one aspect of that, it was the politics and the music. So I was also a punk rocker. I was also a musician. So the music scene and the political scene that I was part of, there were, I would say, most people were at least vegetarian, if not vegan. And so it was kind of like the cool thing to do. But it was also something that I thought of. I was interested in health. I was interested in wellness. I was volunteering for sort of naturopathic, businesses and so on. I was working sometimes in a health food store. So I thought I was being super healthy by being vegan. But eventually, what happened was, and at least, well, the first thing that happened was I got a job in the real world, and the job was doing exactly what I wanted to do. So one reason that I went vegan was really, as I mentioned, the politics of the whole thing. I thought there's one argument around vegetarianism that you're actually conserving food, right? You're not causing food waste. The cows eat so much food, and you could just eat the food that the cows eat. This is the wrong, what I used to believe that I now think is wrong. So I got a job that was actually helping poor communities and farmers across the world. And I would meet up with farming communities and I'd tell them, hey, I'm vegan and isn't that cool? And they were like, what the hell are you talking about? And no, that's not cool, right? And sort of starting to explain to me the basics of how life works, how ecosystems work, and how you're not really saving anyone's life by even eating tofu. So if you want to eat tofu, that's your business, but don't go around telling people that you're doing some noble act, right? So that was the first step, and then but then I maintained some level of vegetarianism right up until my 30s, and then I started getting sick, and my family started getting sick. So I decided it's time to change all that too, and introduced meat. I introduced meat into our diet. It's been about 10 years ago now, so I'd have been in my very late 30s when we first introduced fish. I can still remember the first fish meal I ate, which is probably not the healthiest meal in the whole world. It was a fish curry with rice. But I remember my body was so sated, so satiated after that meal, um, that, yeah, that I couldn't, like, it took me like an hour or two just to sort of recover. Like I don't know how to explain. My body was actually getting nourishment for the first time in many, many years. And since that time, when I actually registered to become a health and nutrition coach, I've come to understand that um, actually vegetables and plant foods in general contain they contain anti-nutrients. Plants don't want to be eaten, and so they contain chemicals which make it harder for animals to digest them. And when we see herbivores in nature, so here in Africa we have giraffes, for example. Giraffes have an interesting relationship with acacia trees because they prey on acacia trees, but the acacia trees will warn. So if a giraffe is eating one tree, that tree releases a scent. Not only does the tree itself make itself bitter, so it tries to release toxins so that the giraffe won't eat it, but it releases a scent so that the other neighboring trees, downwind especially, that pick up this scent will release more and more toxins. So the giraffes will not be able to prey on them. That's one example, but you can look at how bunny rabbits eat. I mean, if anyone's had a garden that's been destroyed by bunny rabbits, the garden, it's not like the bunny rabbits eat a tomato. The rabbits eat a bite of a tomato and then another bite of a tomato. Why are they doing that? Again, because that's how they have to eat in order to avoid the toxins. They can't eat a whole tomato or they can't eat a whole plant because the plant gets more toxic as they eat it. So this is the basics of what I've come to learn about plant biology. And I've come to also learn that humans, as an anthropologist, my PhD is in anthropology, I'm about to be finished with that. Um, as an anthropologist, I've come to understand that humans evolved to be predators, to yes, to be omnivores, but to be omnivores that prefer meat. So and I think there's a lot to be learned from sort of ancestral diets and meat-based diets, and that's how I prefer. So my approach as a health coach is very client-led. So if a client wants to take a vegetarian or a vegetable-based or a plant-based approach, certainly they will do that. There's space for them to do that. But if a client comes to me and says, what do you recommend to reverse autoimmune disease? What do you recommend to reverse diabetes? What do you recommend to balance my hormones? What do you recommend as a diet so that I can start getting my period back? The answer is going to be, we're going to introduce a lot of animal foods and we're going to find healing that way. So yeah, that's the story.
And thank you so much for sharing. So it's very interesting to me as I'm listening to you, because my thinking is like I learned the opposite
All
of,
of us learn the opposite.
if you want to reverse disease and you want to, your periods to come back, and it's the answer is less meat, and introduce more plants into your diet. So it's interesting to hear you say that. So I learned the opposite of what you're
We,
saying.
I think we all learn the opposite, Gabrielle. So and this is one reason got so angry. So what happened to me in 2017? A number of things happened that year. I first started, so I'm now in a different university, but I first got admission to a different university to start my PhD that year. But instead of going to the library where I was meant to go to, the social sciences library, I went to the medical library. Why? Because I myself was having a hard time. I was developing pre-diabetes and maybe eventually it would have been diabetes. My daughter wasn't particularly healthy. She had all kinds of terrible allergies and asthma and eczema and stuff. My wife was suffering with thyroid issues and different autoimmune problems, and she was also on the way to developing diabetes. She'd had gestational diabetes when in the pregnancy. So instead of going to the social sciences library, I went straight to the medical library, and I read everything. And by the way, the other thing is that my best friend had a cancer diagnosis. He's since passed from that diagnosis. So I read everything I could, about cancer, autoimmune, diabetes, etc. Within a day, I was just so angry, Gabrielle. I can't tell you how angry I was at anyone who had told me anything about nutrition or anything who told me anything about health, because they were all completely wrong, and it was in the evidence. There was no denying. People have been reversing diabetes with a meat-based diet since 300 BC, right? There's no denying that. Like that is what was recommended by Indian doctors. The first place where diabetes was discovered was by in an ancient Indian kingdom about 2,300 years ago. Yeah, and that person said, if you want to get diabetes, you eat a lot of rice, because that was the staple food in India. And he said, we see, people who are eating too much rice who get this. They didn't call it diabetes; they called it something like sugar sickness in the local language. And the way we reverse it is we put them on, we just give them more meat. And I don't think he was using an all meat diet, but you increase the amount of meat in the diet and you will reverse the diabetes. So that's been known for more than 2,000 years. And we still, and of course, diabetes, in order to understand this, we have to understand that there is something called metabolic syndrome in the United States, in every Western country, which is a hallmark of disease. It's not a disease in itself, but it underpins the main killers. So accidents aside, so if you're young, dying in a car accident is probably the main accident you have to worry about. I think it's number 3 or number 4 killer. But aside from that, we talk about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse: heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer, and other dementia. And the 4th is metabolic syndrome itself. Metabolic syndrome underpins the other 3. So, and how do we define metabolic syndrome? It's defined clinically as a certain waist to height ratio. So if you have abdominal fat around the abdomen, that's a risk factor. There's certain markers to do with blood sugar and so on. But for me, when I did my research, these are all, they're not very accurate markers sometimes. The main thing that we can measure is rising insulin levels. Insulin is the hormone that we need to process sugar. It's a very easy way to think about it. If you have a high sugar or high carbohydrate, if you have a vegetarian meal, your insulin goes very high. Now, it's possible if you're young, like I was in my 20s, that you can get away with that without much problems, although I did have problems. Looking back at it now, I was never healthy. From the time I was 16, 17, I was extremely unhealthy. And when I got vegan, it was actually worse. But I wasn't dying. I was getting through it, right? And I thought the things that were happening to me, like the gas, the sort of bloating, I thought that was just what happens, the poor digestion. I just thought, that's what eating is like. I didn't think that not having gas and not having bloating was possible. And now I don't get any gas, I don't bloat at all. So I didn't know how to eat from my body. And once I learned that, I realized that I had been unhealthy for basically my whole life, which is a shame. But the point being that, science shows pretty clearly that there's no evidence that vegetables are healthy, going back thousands of years. And if we want to heal, of course, that's not to say that all plants are unhealthy all the time. And there are certain chemicals within plants that have healing properties. So I think this is where we get confused. So when we look at folk medicine here in Africa, or we look at folk medicine in Europe, a lot of that is plant-based in the sense that they will make a tea. They will take, for example, there's something called pau d'arco in South America, right? Strong antibiotic tea. If you ate just pau d'arco, if you eat just the bark, you die. It's poisonous. But if you make a tea out of it, if you ferment that bark for a certain period of time, and you make a tea out of it, that's a very strong antibiotic, which is useful if you need an antibiotic. If you have an infection, that can be super useful. It can also be useful in fighting fungal infections. But if you're taking that every day, you're giving yourself powerful doses of antibiotics for no reason. Just like if you eat broccoli every day or cabbage every day, you're giving yourself high doses of goitrogenic foods, of foods that attack the thyroid gland for no purpose. There's no reason you're doing that. If there's some medical reason, okay, maybe you need to do that for a certain period of time. But now we see if someone dies in an accident, God forbid, we do an autopsy, we see almost all people in the US have like little pieces of goitrogenic stuff stuck in their thyroid. The broccoli is attacking their thyroid, right? From the ages of like 16, 17. Like we've seen this in autopsies of very young people. So there's a book out called Toxic Superfoods by someone called Sally Norton. Very interesting lady, interesting researcher. She's done a lot of work on this. And she focuses on a class of anti-nutrient called oxalates. And the oxalates are found mostly in spinach. If you eat raw spinach, you're getting a huge dose of oxalates. and they're the leading cause of kidney stones, in addition to many other things. There's many gum disease, like they're associated with all kinds of awful things. And stupid me was having spinach juice and spinach smoothies all the time. And I had to. It took me a while to get that stuff out of my system, but I think I'm more or less succeeded. 10 years after I stopped eating that stuff, I think maybe it's out of my system, but I'm not completely sure because it's hard to measure these things. So we have to be aware that when we're eating any plant food, with the exception of some fruits, I would say, but any plant food has some level of anti-nutrients. The fruits are an interesting conversation because, of course, the fruit is the part of the plant that co-evolved with the animal, so that the animal would take the seed of the plant and go and put it somewhere else, right? So the plant sort of wants you to take the fruit. But the problem is we have bred fruits, the fruits that we have today, bananas, mangoes, and so on. These things did not exist in nature. And they are such sugar bombs. I mean, bananas in particular is such a sugar bomb that it's going to spike that insulin again and cause your hyperinsulinemia and all kinds of problems. Now, there's some people on the internet who say, look, if you do this without any fats, it can be okay. And I think there's a point there. So the point is a little bit complicated. I don't know if you want to get to the kind of technical questions around all plant versus all meat diets, but we can if you like.
Well, let's maybe for another show, but I would say so. I'm wondering, is your issue with it? Is it the diet itself? Like, are you against vegetables, or is it just like the diet itself? Well, there's two different things because you talked about being a vegetarian and being vegan, so those are two different
100%.
things.
Yeah.
So is your issue with? Well, I don't know if your issue,
Yeah.
but the problem is it with the 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 diet itself and how it's structured and that it's you know I mean particularly veganism, you're eliminating all animal products, right? So as opposed to vegetarianism, may eat fish. um so is it the diet itself, or is
Yeah.
it like you have
So
a
let's
you don't like
yeah.
vegetables?
So liking vegetables is a slightly different issue because I'm a professional, right? I have a my likes and dislikes don't necessarily come into it, right? So I think we have to distinguish between a number of things. So on the one hand, so the far end of the spectrum is vegan diets. So as you mentioned, vegan diets will not include. So veganism as a philosophy is based on all kinds of things. It's based around ethics, number one, and I think that ethics is wrong. But we don't have to get into that in this discussion. Sticking to health, vegan diets don't include any animal products. That's no eggs, no meat, and no meats. Certainly no dairy, no fish, no nothing. Then there are vegetarian diets. So most vegetarians classify themselves as lacto-ovo vegetarians, meaning that they will eat milk and eggs or dairy products and eggs, but they won't take anything that has a face, is how I used to say it when I was vegetarian, right? So I wouldn't take a fish, fish, shrimp, that kind of stuff I wouldn't have. Then there's pescatarians. So pescatarians do eat, as a rule, dairy products, eggs, and fish. And sometimes, people like certain fish and they don't like certain fish. So some people will have, for example, I know even some people who claim to be vegans who might eat the occasional oyster because oysters don't have brains and central nervous systems and so on. So there's a lot of gray area around here, but as a rule, vegans don't eat oysters, but pescatarians would. All right. And then there's sort of your standard omnivore, what we call a SAD diet, standard American diet, right? And it's sad for a reason. It's a terrible diet. But what I just want to point out about the SAD diet is that it is plant-based. In other words, most of the calories that most people are getting are from plants. So, if you think about the standard American meals, like a burger and fries, the bread, the lettuce, the tomatoes, the fries, that's where most of your calories are coming from. And then there's the kind of diets that I tend to use both for therapeutic purposes and also for, well, the diets that I tend to use for therapeutic purposes are all low carb diets. Let me put it that way. So within the spectrum of low carb, we have a basic low carb, which is basically like you take the standard diet, but you shift the ratios. Okay. So if you want to keep, for example, potatoes on your plate, that's fine, but we're going to limit the potatoes to no more than a quarter of the plate. A quarter of the plate is going to be protein, animal-based protein, ideally, and half the plate is going to be non-starchy cooked vegetables. So the difference that I make in my program is I try and avoid the salads because raw vegetables have too many anti-nutrients, especially the darker greens. So if you're going to have a green, I want it cooked. If you're going to have a salad, like iceberg lettuce could be okay. But I try and avoid that. So that's one therapeutic diet that I use. Another therapeutic diet that I use is a ketogenic diet. So in a ketogenic diet, the idea is to actually get the body into ketosis. Ketosis is a state of fat burning that we can go into. We're all born in ketosis. We're all born um, eating, being able to process fat. Now, just a word on ketosis. Um, in general, there are two fuel sources we think of in the body. One is carbohydrates, so that's just pure sugar, glucose. And too much of that will kill you. We have to be very clear here. Glucose is a toxin in the body, right? If you have a 5-pound bag of sugar, you will die, right? So one is glucose. And by the way, the glucose, 5 pounds is the limit. Many of us who are not metabolically healthy will die before that, right? So the glucose is there. Fat is the other fuel. So we all have about 100,000 calories of fat on our body. And there's certain organs that can digest the fat straight, right? So the liver, for example, can just take the fat if it wants to, right? And burn on and use that for fuel. But there are other organs, particularly the brain, that needs the fat to be broken up into something smaller. And that something smaller is called a ketone body. So there's several ketone bodies. The main one is beta hydroxybutyrate. Again, we don't have to get into the details, but that is a ketone body that is small enough to cross the blood-brain barrier. So the brain actually loves ketones. If ketones are available, the brain will suck them up. Otherwise, the brain needs glucose. Okay. Then the last therapeutic diet that I use is a carnivore diet. So this is someone who, in my version of carnivore, we don't do pure meat. We tend to avoid it if it's at all possible. Sometimes, like I have a client at the moment whose gut is so messed up that we really need to do an only meat diet. That's the only thing that he can really handle. And in his case, that's going to be the case for a couple of months till he starts to heal, and then we'll introduce some vegetables. But in general, the way I prefer to do carnivore with clients who want to do that, I prefer to keep in some fermented vegetables, and maybe a little bit of low carb fruit if you want, like some blueberries or something if you want. So I'm not super strict, is what I'm trying to say. I adapt these approaches to the needs of the client. Does that make sense?
Yes and no.
Okay.
The no part is, I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like maybe it's just me personally and the way my body works, but like eating too much meat for me, like I get sleepy and then I feel gassy. I feel like it's rotting in my stomach, and then it's the flatulence, right? So I think the introducing more like plant. I mean, not like
Yeah.
the vegan burgers, like that's a question mark. But it's
Yeah.
like
No, I'm with you. So the symptoms you're
like things
describing.
like just like tomatoes and beans and vegetables. It's like it does kind of, I feel like purified more in a way when I introduce that more as opposed
Yeah.
to just like strictly eating burgers and so it's like
Yeah, I'm with you. So the tough thing is, and this is tough, it was tough for me too, is that when we have been eating a largely plant-based diet, and I think all of us, are eating mostly plant-based diet, or nearly all of us are eating mostly a plant-based diet. The problem is a number of physiological adaptations happen to make our body better able to digest plants and less able to digest meat, right? And one of those physiological adaptations that's perhaps the worst, I think by far the worst, and one that I think I need to test, but based on your symptoms you do suffer from, is a low stomach acidity. What does that mean? The acidity of the human stomach is very high. That means our pH is very low. We are among the most acidic stomachs in the animal kingdom. Healthy human stomach should be about 1.5 or less. Okay? To give you a comparison, a lion's stomach, lion clearly only eats meat, is about 2.5 to 3. So our stomach is 10 times more acidic than a lion's stomach. A chimp stomach is about, so you remember the pH scale. If you go from 2 to 1, that's 10 times. But if you go from 3 to 1, that's 100 times, right? So a chimp stomach is more than 100 times less acidic than our stomach. Why do they have that? Chimps have less acidic stomachs, and other herbivores have less acidic stomachs because they need lots of bugs in there. They need lots of bugs to help them digest the fiber. They're not going to be able to break down all those plants on their own. They need to have a little zoo inside their gut, and they have a special place to ferment those things. Now, the problem is most of people who are eating a standard diet have these symptoms that if we try and suddenly shift them, or even we don't have to shift them, they will complain of these symptoms no matter what. If they have a mixed meal of some carbohydrates and some fats and some meat, they will complain of the symptoms you're talking about, gaseous, and it feels like it's not moving anywhere. There's a lack of motility, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to supplement in order to get the stomach pH back to where it should be. And by the way, we have to do this with vegans too. Like eventually your symptoms are going to get so bad that you're going to have to do this no matter what you're eating. So, and what do we supplement with? Well, it depends on the age of the client. What I tend to find is that people who are older tend to need digestive enzymes. So these are things like, again, chemicals from papaya and pineapple and things that will help break down the meat if we're putting them on a higher meat diet. So we give them a pill of that kind of stuff, or you can marinate the meat in that kind of juice or something if you want as well to break it down a little bit. People who are younger, like probably your age, we actually need to give hydrochloric acid. So we're actually giving very strong acid to reduce the pH of the stomach, to reduce the symptoms. Now, this is all, I don't take this as medical advice. You need to do it in consultation with someone who knows what they're doing. But if we do this the right way, we can actually fix a lot of the problems. Now, the other problem that we have is, especially when people leave a plant-based diet, they tend, and I did this too, like everyone's going to do this. There's just natural instinct. I don't mean, there's no judgment in anything that I'm saying. I'm just explaining how the process tends to work and the mistakes that we tend to make is that we will take, so let's take my vegan meal, right? My favorite vegan meal was like, I'd have this pasta with like peanut sauce and tofu that I would make, right? So let's say I took that same thing. So pasta with a peanut butter sauce, like it was a super like university college food kind of stuff, yeah? I'd come back late at night and make a peanut sauce and throw some cooked spaghetti in there, kind of thing. Let's say I did that whole thing and I put a steak on top of that. Now the problem is I've got so much carbohydrates in that pasta. It's a big bowl of pasta. I've got so much fats in the peanuts, and now I'm adding another layer of fat and carbohydrates. So I think it's important here to talk about not fat and carbohydrates, fat and protein with the steak. So I think it's important to talk about energy versus protein. So we have three macronutrients. The three macronutrients are carbohydrates, fats, and protein. Carbohydrates and fats are generally energy sources. And if we have, most of us, like myself, when I started this journey, I was 40 pounds heavier, right? So most of us have, at that time, I had too much fat on my body. And what was happening was there's something called the Randall cycle, which says that if we have carbohydrates and fats in the same meal, we actually get kind of a double dose. You're getting like all that is sort of sucked into the cells in a toxic way. It's creating what we call energy toxicity. So if I do the standard plant-based switching to meat stuff, which is basically to keep the plant-based meal and just put a steak on top or put some meat on top, you can actually make your symptoms worse. So the way I generally recommend is I won't, if someone's eating a standard diet, I won't make them go to carnivore. That's ridiculous. I will first take away some carbohydrates, replace that with good quality lean protein, maybe slowly. Then increase when we've got the carbohydrates pretty much down to zero on the plate, then we increase the fats, the healthy fats, slowly. Again, everything has to be done slowly because the digestive system is used to what you ate yesterday. If you give it something completely different, you're going to have serious reactions. So you have to give it what you ate yesterday, but with some adjustments and with a target in mind, right? So there's a process that has to be done.
So is it just the issue is that people who are vegetarian or vegan, more so vegan, they're not incorporating protein into the diet? Is that what it is? And is that the argument that you're trying to make? Is that with vegans, they're like they'll eat like you said, like the pasta and the peanut sauce, but there's no.
I was putting tofu in that. I was putting tofu in that. So
they're just not getting protein. Is that what it is?
Remember, I was a very health conscious vegan. And so I was putting the tofu or the beans in there or something, and I thought I was getting protein. The problem is I didn't understand about the protein digestibility indexes, right? So you read on a package of tofu, for example, you read that it has, 30 grams of protein is my guess. Don't quote me. I haven't eaten tofu in a long, long time. But let's say for the sake of argument, it has 30 grams of protein. There's something called the protein digestibility index. There's actually two of these. One is called PDCAS and one is called DIAS. DIAS is the better one. So what they did is when you eat these things, because they come with anti-nutrients, right? A lot of it is not able to be digested. So what they did is they looked at the digestive tract, they looked at it in the pig. Pig is actually quite similar to digestive tract to a human. And they measured how much was actually coming out of the small intestine, right? So how much protein was there and how much protein was bound up and coming up the small intestine. And what you found is that all of the plant proteins are not complete proteins in the sense that they're not, you don't digest those 30 grams. In the case of tofu, I think my guess per soy was about 60%. So if it's 30 in there, you're at most getting about 20, okay? 20 grams of protein. Now the problem is, in order to trigger something called protein muscle synthesis, right? So in order to trigger the positive aspects of eating a high protein meal, we need at least about 30 grams of protein. So I picked 30 kind of at random, but not at random, because that's to me what a high protein meal looks like, is 30 grams of protein. If you have 30 grams of animal protein, you're going to hit that 100% of the time, pretty much. Yeah, 100% of the time you're going to hit that. If you have 30 grams of plant protein, you're pretty much never going to hit that. It's all less than one. And it depends. So you have to go more. Now, the problem is, if you're talking about getting your protein from beans and tofu and so on, now you're talking about increasing the amount of that. And how many beans can you eat? Can you eat a kilo of cooked beans in a serving? That's 2.5 pounds. Can you do that? Nobody can. There's no way. So when vegans say you can get all your protein you need from beans, yeah, technically that's true. But there are limits in terms of the size of the stomach. And if you eat that many beans every day, you're going to have serious digestive issues. And I know, because those are my clients. Some of my clients are the ones who have these serious digestive issues. And it's hard to, I mean, it's very difficult for me to help the ones who insist on being vegan. Let me put it that way. Because yes, we can fix the stomach, but then I can't give you a way when when I teach you how to eat, or if I try to work out a vegan meal plan for you, your digestive distress is going to come back again. And like I say, people can get away with this stuff maybe in their teens, maybe in their 20s. I don't recommend it in your teens or 20s, because your lifetime protein muscle synthesis, your lifetime sort of muscle mass maxes out at age 25. So we actually want people eating as many high protein meals as possible up before age 25. So just so that they can maximize that muscle mass. And then as we get older, as you get to my age in your 40s and 50s, then we start losing muscle, and it becomes even harder for us to digest protein as well. So it's actually super important as we get older to increase both the quantity and quality of protein that we're eating as well. So protein is a big part of it. Is it the only part of it? No. As I mentioned, there are anti-nutrients that are just, I think, that are underappreciated sort of plague that we're dealing with. The number of people I know with autoimmune disease, the number of people I know with weird allergies developed later in life, and so on. I mean, it's crazy. And I think a huge part of this is, well, I can just say from experience, when we take the plant toxins out of the diet, people heal. They heal quickly.
So I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around it, because it's like, oh wow, I had a completely different idea when it comes to nutrition. So now, so in terms of meat itself, so you're not recommending like 100% meat. Like, you're saying, like, you still need the carbs, you still need.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm not certainly not saying you need anything. What I'm saying is people should eat how they need to eat in order to heal. And for most people, you don't need to go on a purely carnivorous diet in order to heal. But some people do. And in that case, we should. You certainly don't need carbohydrates. That much is true. There are essential fatty acids. There are essential amino acids, meaning proteins. There's no essential carbohydrate. The way I tend to, most of my clients want to keep some plant foods in. They don't want to be carnivore for the rest of their lives. And so I worry about being very strictly carnivore for long periods of time, because then reintroducing the plant foods can become a little bit tricky. So the way I do carnivore, as I mentioned, I prefer to keep some fermented vegetables in particular. So kimchi, sauerkraut. Why fermented? Because those are traditionally the ways that we detoxified the vegetables. Korean culture learned how to detoxify vegetables through a process of fermenting them, making a pickle called kimchi, which is also tasty. And it's much easier to digest. And, it's really good. I think it has a lot of plant polyphenols, which are good for the microbiome. So I think fermenting vegetables, you get some of the benefits without any of the harm. So, if you ask me what's like the ideal diet for humans who want to heal, it would be, by calories, it would be like 90% meat and 10% fermented vegetables.
So now, is it certain is it any meat, or is it like, I mean, can someone eat, because there's heavier meats, like there's the goats, there's the lighter meats like chicken.
So the
Um
heavy, lighter stuff, I don't really agree with. I mean, so what we tend to use the most is red meat in general. So beef, lamb, and goat, yes. And there is some evidence saying that keeping fish in is important, but I'm kind of in two minds about that, so I don't really care. But the basic story is, if someone comes to me and they need to heal, the short answer, the quickest thing I will tell them is, okay, how can we get more meat into your diet? And if they say I like pork, they're going to eat more pork. If they say I like fish, they're going to eat more fish. If they say I like beef, they're going to eat more beef. Then we take it from there. So at the general level, there's no big rule. Eventually, what people tend to do, and what I think is probably the healthiest and the most ancestrally appropriate, is to mostly eat ruminant meat. Why ruminant meat? Because ruminants, as are those animals with multiple stomachs. So the problem in our modern food system, in sort of capitalist food systems, is that we tend to cut corners and we tend to feed the animals crap whenever we can, right? And in the case of a chicken or a pig, for example, or even fish, when you feed that animal crap, that some of that crap stays in the animal, stays in the fat particularly, and then you eat it, and now you have crap in you, right? Really poor quality food. Like, think of those pellets they feed the fish. I mean, it's just terrible stuff, right? In fish farms. So, but in the case of a cow, first of all, there's some ruminants like bison and lamb and sheep that really can only be fed grass. So if you're getting bison, if you're getting sheep, it's 100% grass fed, grass finished, everything, right? Even beef, commercially available beef in the United States, is fed grass for most of its life. It spends the last couple of months on some grains in order to fatten up, but because or the grain finished ones, right? Not the grass finished ones. But because cows have multiple stomachs, the fatty acid profile doesn't change so much. So there's a number of people in my space who say, no, you can only eat grass finished, et cetera, et cetera. I don't believe that. If you look at the data, if you look at the actual studies, if you look at the people looking at the fat content of grass finished versus grain finished cows under a microscope, there's not much of a difference. And what I've seen in my own practice is, I mean, I know people who've been on grain finished meat for years and years and are very, very healthy, and that's pretty much all they eat. So I haven't seen any evidence of any problem with grain finished beef. I do see, I won't say, I do see anecdotal evidence. Like, again, like if someone only wants to eat chicken, fine, no problem, if that's what you want to do. But it's not my favorite. I would say, because chickens tend to, as I say, the crap that they're fed. So again, chickens are fed these pellets and soy, and it's got all kinds of weird stuff in there. In fact, we have a story. My wife, at some point when we were getting off the vegetarian diet, my wife developed a very severe soy allergy, and for a while she couldn't take any chicken, any eggs. Why? Because the chicken and eggs were being fed soy, and the soy was ending up in there, and she was allergic to it. So now we were able to undo those allergies. Now she can have chicken and eggs if she wants to, but in general, we find, again, we prefer to eat beef and lamb as much as we can.
So it's about, so certain animals. So it's about how the animals are fed, and and that adds into the
It's the
argument about,
physiology of the it's the
yeah.
physiology of the cows have a physiology where you can feed them crap and it won't end up in their fat. Chickens don't have that. Chickens only have one stomach. Cows have four, right?
So beef. So you more beef, more lamb, less chicken.
I mean, like I say, this is like, a lot of this is personal preference. So if someone says they want to
Yeah.
eat chicken, just eat chicken and see how you feel. But what we find is that over time, people tend to gravitate to the less toxic meats, which to me are the ruminant meats, and wild caught fish if you can get it.
So my thing is, though, you can still have diseases by eating a lot of meat, because there's hormones being injected into animals, right? And it's the crap that they're eating that you're talking about, and you know that, and then we're spraying pesticides on the vegetables that the animals are eating, which ends up inside them, and then in turn ends up inside of us. So there's that food chain. So what do you say about, what's your argument with that, about you could still get, I mean, you're saying, introduce more meat into the diet to reverse autoimmune diseases, but there's still other diseases that you can get from eating too much meat. So,
So
what
what
do you
disease can you get from eating too much meat?
like if you're I mean, depending on how the animal is cooked, like that stuff that could also be digestive because it's rotting inside of you and in your intestines.
Yeah, so I think we need to debunk a lot of this. So as far as I'm aware, right, um, there is the first thing about this rotting inside of you stuff, like that's complete nonsense. So the food that rots inside you is actually the vegetable food because that has to get to the colon where it has to rot, it has to be fermented, right? And you don't actually get a lot of the nutrition. A lot of that is there to feed the microbiome. So plant foods tend to be digested further down. That also means they get excreted quicker, but there's more sort of rotting going on. There's less actual digestion. So we need to distinguish between what happens in the small intestine, which is actual, that's for humans. What happens in the small intestine is for humans. What happens in the large intestine, the colon, that's for the bugs in you. That's for the microbiome. The microbiome is very important, right? I'm not saying that it's not important. But meat is digested in the small intestine. Meat is where you get nutrition from, right? Meat is digested further up the system, and meat is digested slowly. Why? Because it's got a lot more nutrients. The body wants to suck as many nutrients as it can out of that meat. So it does take 12 to 14 hours for meat to be digested. Absolutely true. But it's not the case that it's rotting in there, right? Especially if it might be rotting if you don't have an acidic enough stomach, if you don't have an acidic enough small intestine, right? But that's a problem that can be fixed. That's a clinical diagnosis that we can make and that we can fix, right? So, but if the human gut is functioning correctly, there's no rotting that's going on, except in the large intestine. When you have plant foods that are not digested, that do rot in a shorter period of time, 6 to 8 hours. But it's kind of gross, man. Like I don't want to go into how much farting and all this kind of gassy stuff that I had to deal with when I was vegan, but it's not pleasant, right? So I think we have to just make that distinction that actually, first of all, what happens in the small intestine, that's actual nutrition. When you're eating only plants, those go straight to the large intestine. They are not feeding you. It's a form of starvation. It's a form of fasting, not food, right? So even even the plant foods that I recommend keeping in. Why am I recommend keeping them in? For the bugs, not for the human. The human isn't getting anything from that. So once we understand that plants, it's really, really difficult to get any nourishment at all from plants, then we can actually start to have a proper discussion about human nutrition. Does that make sense? And from my perspective as an anthropologist, I mean, you go back in the history and you see what Homo erectus and Homo neanderthalis were eating. I mean, they were eating massive mastodons, elephants, and all these kind of things. And they're, when we try and figure out from their bones how much meat they were eating per day, some of the numbers we're getting are insane. Like 1.5 kilos a day. That's like 3 pounds of meat a day per person. And those are we're the descendants. We're living descendants of those people. So, and remember, those people they were taller than us. They had bigger brains than us. They seem to be healthier than us when we look at their bones. They didn't get the kind of old age diseases. It's very hard to tell the age of a Stone Age human because you can have a human who's clearly this person. You can see that there's evidence that the person was older than 20, but they have the bones of a 20-year-old because their bones never got old. They stayed young, right? So that's our history. And what I'm trying to say is that if we eat according to that history, at least we're going to be as healthy as possible. At least we're not going to have these new diseases, the diseases of modernity, the diseases of civilization, the diseases that we all see around us every day: heart disease, cancer, and dementia, Alzheimer's. These are the main killers. And to be honest, they don't need to be killers. If we ate ancestrally appropriate meat-based diets, they wouldn't be killers.
And then the thing is, I mean, to eat how the ancestors eat, the thing is, the ancestors were in a different time. So do you think, I mean, there wasn't a lot of industrialization. There wasn't a lot of, so it's
I
a
mean, we
different
have.
time. How can we eat like the ancestors eat?
So let me put it to you this way, right? So we take a tiger from the wild, capture the tiger, we put it in the zoo, right? Do we certainly start feeding the tiger Cheerios? And is that what we think is an appropriate diet for the tiger? Or do we do our research to figure out, okay, we've changed the tiger's environment, but what was it eating in the wild? and we have to get it a diet that's as close to what it was in the wild as we can today? And the answer is that we do the latter. And humans, physiologically, we haven't changed in 350,000 years. We are genetically identical to that human 350,000 years ago. So what would be the hypothesis? Your hypothesis is that in industrial capitalism, something changes in human physiology so that we need another kind of diet. Seems like a pretty ridiculous hypothesis to me, right? So the hypothesis, the fact that we haven't changed in 300,000 years, that's a matter of fact. No one can dispute that. No paleoanthropologist will dispute that. No anthropologist will dispute that, right? So given that that's the case, doesn't it make sense to look at the diets we evolved to eat 300,000 years ago and use that at least as the starting point and take away all the crap? And by crap, I don't just mean the obvious crap, the chocolate but things like peanuts. I mean, how would we have had access to peanuts in the wild? Maybe in a very short period of time, or tree nuts, or even fruit. The fruit that exists today is way more sugary than fruit that existed even a few hundred years ago. Or things like the brassica family of vegetables, the entire family of vegetables, which has only existed for a couple of hundred years, right? Some of them are newer than that: broccolis, cauliflowers, cabbages, etc., right? These are new foods, and I'm not saying we can't eat them, but we should just be aware that they are not appropriate food for humans. Like, I'm not saying your cat can't have a treat of some kind, or your dog can't have I don't know what dog treats are, but like I knew a dog who would like licking, even chocolate pudding off the plates of his owners or something like that. I'm not saying that's bad, but if you're going to do that to your dog, you should understand that that's not an ancestrally appropriate diet, and they may get sick. And if you're going to do that to yourself, you should understand that that's not an ancestrally appropriate diet, and you may get sick. Now, in humans, it's a little bit more complicated because we're all trying to just survive. I mean, life is tough. You're living in New York City, I believe, which is one of the busiest places in the world, and high stress place, right? So if people get addicted to carbohydrates and get addicted to sugar and want to eat these things, go for it. I'm not saying you can't do that, but just be aware that you're treating it like a drug in that case. Food is your drug to get through the day, which is totally fine. No judgment. I was addicted to cigarettes for years. I do have the odd drink and so on. So I'm nothing against drugs. You can use drugs, but be aware of what you're doing. Make sense? I think I've lost you, Gabrielle. Can you hear me? Sorry, I think I lost you for a second. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah. So now what? So just to wind things down a bit. So now, what is your recommendation? What do you want people to know about having an animal-based diet?
I mean, I think the first thing to say is that most of us, even those of us who aren't vegetarian, most of us are eating plant-based diets. And I think those come with potential side effects, and we should all be aware of them. And sometimes you don't feel the side effects at age 20 or 30, but by the time you get a bit older, you should know what's going on. So point number one is that we're all eating plant-based diets, and the diseases that we're seeing in society are a result of the diets that we're eating. Now we can say, okay, there's junk food and there's other things in there, etc. Fair enough. But point two is that there's no evidence behind the plant-based recommendations. Another problem that we have is that the bias that you had going into this discussion, it's everyone's bias for a reason. It's what we've been told since the 1970s. In fact, it's what the dietitians have been saying since the 1920s. And there's a reason for that. And I don't need to go into it, but the people who set up the modern schools of nutrition were religiously motivated people, Seventh-day Adventists, who had an agenda of pushing vegetarianism. And the way that they chose to do that was to set up schools of dietetics and so on. So just to say that there's no evidence behind those guidelines, there's no evidence behind that school of nutrition at all. But they've been able to exert a lot of power without the evidence. And number three is that the default human diet is a meat-based diet. And until we have evidence that some other diet is going to be safe for us, we should assume that if we have any issues at all, we should go back to a meat-based diet. And at some point in our life, all of us are going to have a problem. Right now, the statistics say that if you're born in the year 2000, you have a 50% chance of getting cancer by the time you're 50 or 60. Sorry. So it's, all of us are heading down a road. Um, and we need to be aware that when we come across health that is less than optimal, when we have any issues, we should revert to a default human diet, which is going to be a meat-based, animal-based diet.
You're not necessarily advocating for 100%
As
meat.
I mentioned,
You're still
yeah,
advocating a balanced diet.
no. So I hate the term balanced diet. I think it's really inappropriate. Like if we look at what humans would have been eating in the past, again, it would have been like maybe you get some seasonal berries or something in the daytime or some tubers or something, but that's enough to get you through the hunt. In the hunt, you kill an animal and you're eating that animal for the next 2 or 3 days. So I think this idea of balanced diet is super problematic. I'm in, but that said, I'm in favor of people eating how they want to eat.
Mm-hmm.
And so, with that in mind, that most people don't want to do a purely carnivorous diet, I don't usually use that. I do use it for therapeutic purposes for people who have really damaged their gut, usually through veganism. So, if someone's gut is super damaged, we need to go on a purely carnivorous, not a gram of plant foods for a certain period of time. But then usually we try and reintroduce plant foods because most people do want a little bit. We're living in the real world, you know. My my daughter is going to turn 15 in a couple months. I want to have a slice of birthday cake. You know, that's life, right? So in order to do that, my gut needs to be at a certain level of healing, and I also need to be able to tolerate a variety of foods. So I'm not saying I'll have cake every day, but I will keep some plant foods in, you know, at least a few times a week, so that I can tolerate plant foods when I'm exposed to them. But you know, so there's a difference. But if someone's, as I mentioned, super sick, especially with gut health, then we would need to take the plant foods out altogether. But in general, I don't advocate that. That's true. I don't. It's not that I don't advocate it. It's just that I don't need to use it clinically. In general, we can hit the targets. We can fix you. We can fix your gut. We can fix your autoimmune issues. We can fix your diabetes. We can help you lose weight without going to a purely carnivorous diet, unless you want to. In general, we can use other methods to get there.
Okay, so it depends on the individual, and it
one Hundred
depends on
percent.
the pH balance and how much how much meat can they tolerate? How can their bodies tolerate?
Well, it's not about how much meat can our bodies tolerate, because I think all of us can live on a purely carnivorous, and nearly all of us can live on a purely carnivorous diet if we wanted to. But it's more about what do you want to do? Like what do you need in order to be able to heal? So if someone's coming to me, for example, I have vitiligo. So the autoimmune disease that I have is called vitiligo. This whole arm was pretty much white. Now there's just a couple of spots here. Oh, at the moment it's showing up okay. But you know, if I'm walking down the street, no one can tell that I have vitiligo, right? I got rid of it. Yeah, I did use a purely carnivorous diet, but that was like a month-long experiment, right? I've gotten rid of this mostly through just increasing the amount of meat that I eat and reducing carbohydrates and spending time in ketosis and so on. So with a variety of strategies, but you know, you can reverse autoimmune without going pure carnivore for sure. Maybe it'll help going pure carnivore, but you don't need to if you don't want to.
So I guess I'm still trying to wrap my head around this. So pure carnivore, what do you mean by that?
So there's a you know, you're obviously not in the same Facebook groups I am. So there's a growing number of people. I call them kind of the carnivore cultists, who, and I don't, I mean, it's I was sort of one of them. So I don't mean to be disparaging. Like I understand what they're doing, but for me it shouldn't be a religion, right? So there are people who, like, you know, all I eat is beef and water, and if you eat anything else, you're out of the club, kind of thing, right? You did it wrong. You don't know what you're doing. They're exactly the mirror of vegans, right? Um, what I'm saying is, if all you want to have is beef and water and associated fat, go for it. Knock yourself out. I don't care. But that's a small, tiny minority of people on this planet, and I am here to help. I don't know if I can help the majority. That's a bit ambitious, but I'm here to help anyone who wants help with a variety of strategies. You don't have to. If you come to me and you don't want to be a pure carnivore, I'm still going to help you. In fact, if you come to me and you want to stay vegan, I'm still going to try to help you, but I'm going to warn you that it's going to be difficult, right? And most people, you know, they'll they'll introduce some animal foods at some point in working with me. Um,
So I mean, yeah, so there's the extremes, right? You have
yeah,
the vegans, which is one end, and then you have the pure carnivores in the other end, right? So I'm just, I guess, your goal in terms of what do you want your clients to achieve? What do you help your clients to achieve is to be somewhere in the middle, not really be in the extremes.
Most clients want that, and most clients are fine with that. There are people, for example, people with eating disorders or with a history of eating disorders, who we find that actually a purely carnivorous approach tends to be really beneficial. People say, well, that's another eating disorder. I disagree. Because, as I said, because I think this is a default human diet. So what we find with people with a history of eating disorders, sometimes we'll put them on a purely carnivorous diet, and they, for the first time in their lives, they don't have a strenuous relationship with food. So that, there's a power in pure carnivore that I don't want to deny.
Mm-hmm.
But most people don't want that. Most people want to be able to have a slice of birthday cake at their daughter's birthday or whatever, right? And so that's why the versions of the diets that I tend to use keep some plant foods in and are a little bit more flexible. Now it's difficult because plant foods, it's like a person by person case. If someone is presenting with type 2 diabetes, and then what plant foods do we keep in? Well, we can't really keep the fruits in at all. Like, even probably blueberries have too much sugar for them, so we need to take the fruits out altogether. If someone is presenting with thyroid issues, then do I want to give them fermented cabbage in kimchi? Maybe not. Maybe we'll try and find something else that they can tolerate better. So the meat is like, anyone can have more meat. There's no problem with that. Plant
Mm-hmm.
foods, it becomes a very complicated discussion. Like, what plant foods can we keep in? What do we take out? You mentioned beans. Beans have lectins. Lectins, the most famous lectin is gluten, but all plants have lectins. And lectins bind with certain minerals. And the problem in our diets is we tend to have the same plant foods again and again. And those plant foods are binding with the same minerals. So we have people who are showing up with massive iron deficiencies, massive calcium deficiencies, massive, like, things you wouldn't think of. Copper deficiencies. Copper is a micronutrient that you need in really, really small quantities. But if someone hasn't eaten, for example, beef in years, beef is a very good source of copper. Um, or zinc, right? Or, copper and zinc are together in tandem. So if someone is having too much zinc, then they can have a copper deficiency. If someone is having too much copper, they can have zinc deficiency. So these are really complicated discussions. And the problem I have with the plant foods is, again, they're all causing some kind of imbalance, unless they're fermented. So ideally, if you want to formulate a vegetarian diet that's healthy, you need to be eating different foods like every day of the week. You need to really be mixing it up. But that's not possible in the modern food environments for most of us. So that's why we tend to say, if you want to stay healthy, you probably want to try the animal based rather than the vegetable based, the plant based diets.
So I think you are. I'm having an internal battle listening to you talk, but I think you are bringing light to the dark side of veganism and vegetarianism, is that you are you're not getting enough protein that your body needs, and you're not getting enough nutrients that your body needs. Um and it's as humans, like, we need to consume more naturally. So it does highlight the dark side of having a plant-based diet. Um and it does lead to diseases when you're not getting enough nutrients, and you're not getting you're not getting that sustenance. Um but I think we also have to acknowledge that the same thing can go from just eating just purely meat. Like, you could still, that might be too, your body can be oversaturated with nutrients.
So I don't think that's the case. So yeah, I mean, you'd have to give me a very specific example. The only example I know of in history, in nature of, or in the human record, of someone poisoning themselves with animal foods. I'm not talking about food poisoning or something. Food poisoning can happen with anything, and the biggest cause of food poisoning in the United States is salad, by some huge factor, I think. So forget about food poisoning. That's a different discussion. But the only case was someone who accidentally, or who ate polar bear liver. Polar bear liver has something like 5,000 or 500,000. I'm not going to get the number right, but has a huge amount of vitamin A. So you can get vitamin A toxicity from eating polar bear liver, but most of us are not going around eating polar bear liver. And even the Inuit who eat polar bear, they don't eat the liver. So I don't know that this is I work in facts. I work in concrete stuff. So if you give me a case of someone who's poisoned themselves by eating a pound and a half of meat a day, the other thing with meat is that it unlike the hyper processed palatable junk foods out there, where they say, bet you can't eat one. Well, they've designed it so that it's super addictive, and you won't be able to eat just one. You won't be able to eat just one bag. You eat as many bags of the chips as there are in the house, right? Because that's how it's designed. It's designed to be super addictive. Meat has satiety mechanisms associated with it. So if I eat a pound of meat, I can't have any more. You go to the Chinese takeaway or whatever, you have all the spare ribs you can eat. You can't have any more. But then suddenly someone says, how about dessert? And you say, oh yeah, I can have dessert, right? Because dessert is that hyper palatable junk again. But you can't have more meat than once your body's full. There's satiety mechanisms that kick in because that's proper human food. Humans are supposed to eat until they're full and then not eat anymore, right? So in answer to your question, is there a problem associated with too much meat? I think the answer is no. Now, if I play devil's advocate, the only problem that people claim to see is that you're eating more saturated fat, especially people who eat dairy. Dairy is the biggest source of saturated fat by a good measure. And saturated fat, by some estimates, very bad estimates, in my opinion, is associated with heart disease. So, I mean, this is a whole nother discussion. But again, I mean, I can just give you my own example. So, I do eat dairy. I do eat a lot of saturated fat. I have LDL cholesterol through the roof. I have LDL cholesterol around 400 or so on. I had high LDL cholesterol even when I was LDL cholesterol is a misnomer. I don't know how scientific we want to get. LDL is a lipoprotein that carries cholesterol around the body. LDL cholesterol is necessary for life. I mean, this is just the very basic stuff. When I go to see a new doctor, I say, hi, my name is Sameer and I have an LDL of 400. That's how I introduce myself, as if I'm an alcoholic, right? And then the doctor says, okay, have you thought about statins? I said, I don't want to take statins because statins are associated with diabetes. Diabetes give us all the problems that I mentioned: cancer, dementia, heart disease, etc. And one doctor said, look, why don't you go and at least get tested? Now, I've had an LDL in the between 400 and say 600 for 6 or 7 years, okay, since I first started doing this. So you would think, and before that it was high. And by the way, I used to smoke cigarettes as well. So you'd think I'd be in a very high risk category for heart disease. So I got myself checked. I got what's called a coronary artery calcium score. This measures the amount of calcified plaque in the heart, right? And my score was 0, right? Now I'm 47 years old. A third of men my age have a positive score. They have a non-zero score, right? Zero scores is basically meant to be that you're pretty much bulletproof when it comes to heart disease, right? Nothing's going to happen to you for at least 5 years, and then you need to get retested, right? So, I mean, just to say that I won't go into the whole science of the cholesterol debate right here, but just to say that the cholesterol discussion was founded on some pretty shoddy science back in the 1950s. And there's data coming out. In fact, there's data coming out next week, December 8th, which will be a huge step forward in understanding how LDL is not necessarily associated with heart disease, especially in people consuming a mostly meat diet.
Yeah. Well, this is a very complex issue, and unfortunately, we got to wrap this up. But it's very complex, and it's, there's a lot of different sides here, and we didn't even get into the controversy of people don't like eating cute animals, and so we didn't get into the controversy of that. But but
I think I lost you again, Gabrielle. Can you hear me?
so much.
Yeah, now you're muted, but you're back. Yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm
Sorry.
back. Like, I keep freezing. All right. So I like to ask my guests words of wisdom. Do you have any words of wisdom you'd like to share with our audience?
Yeah, no, I think we've been through most of it. I mean, I think valuing your health is really important. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's all we have. I look at my friends who have lost their health even for a short period of time, and everything else goes by the wayside. All of your creative projects, your relationships, nothing else matters if you don't have your health. So we just encourage all your listeners to make decisions that they think are healthy. And if those decisions are not serving their health, then of course they're welcome to reach out to me or another health coach who can help them find the path to health that best suits them.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, Sameer, thank you so much for coming on Hot Topics, and thank you for coming back on my show. I appreciate you being here.
No, it's only a pleasure, Gabrielle. Thanks so much.
All right. So here's the opportunity to promote your services, promote your business. Please promote away.
So I'm at sameerdossani.net. At the moment, I'm offering a reversing vitiligo course for a super cheap price of just $97. That's going to go up in the new year, but that is the price of the course right now. Super important, 4 weeks, reversing vitiligo and other autoimmune diseases. You're welcome to check it out. It's at sameerdossani.net/reversing vitiligo. And if anyone wants to reach out, just have a quick chat. You can find out how to book a call with me there too.
Beautiful, beautiful. And let me just take a moment to shout out your social media. So you guys heard it yourself. I'm just gonna point out where you can learn more about him. So you can find him online. It is sameerdossani.net. That is his website. You can follow him on YouTube. It is at Meat Heals. So just make sure you check him out there. He is on Twitter and TikTok. It is just his name, Sameer Dossani. He's on Instagram. The account name is SAM, the number 3 and R. He is also on LinkedIn. It is his name, Sameer Dossani, and he is on Facebook. You can follow him. The page is called Sameer Dossani Health Coaching. So, of course, all of these handles and information will be in the description. So, I encourage you to follow him on all of his social media and check him out. If you want to learn about his coaching services, if you want his services, if maybe you heard something today and you're like, what? That doesn't make sense. Reach out to him, and definitely pick his brain. The information is on your screen right now if you're watching this on video. But if you are listening to this on a podcast, don't worry. Like I said, all of this information is in the description. So I encourage you to check it out. So, Sameer, thank you again for coming on Hot Topics.
Oh, it's only a pleasure, Gabrielle. Hopefully we can do a third time sometime soon.
Yeah, awesome, awesome. All right, all right, all right. All right, you guys, and that is it. We have reached the conclusion of yet another episode. Thank you so much for joining me. So let me just take a moment to just remind you guys that Hot Topics is a production of my tutoring company, A Step Ahead Tutoring Services. So if you are looking for any kind of academic assistance, or maybe your child is struggling in school in some way, failing grades, not doing their homework, they're lazy, maybe their teachers are complaining about them all the time. If there's any kind of issue that's going on in school, or maybe you want to just let your child have that extra academic help, that boost, hit us up. Our tutors are available. You can connect with us online. Our website is www.astepaheadtutoringservices.com. You could also find us on social media. We are on most of the social media platforms. So just type in A Step Ahead Tutoring Services and we will pop up. Make sure you look for the pencil logo with the gray and black tip. That is us. You could find us on Facebook, YouTube, TikTok. What else? And a Instagram, and there's a couple others that are not coming to me right now, but you could find us online for sure. So follow us on our social media accounts as well. And of course, Hot Topics is on a podcast, so please subscribe to us as well on your favorite podcast platform. And I also want to encourage you to let us know your thoughts about this episode today. Any Did you agree? Did you not agree? This is definitely very controversial, but definitely drop those comments in the comment below, the comment section below, excuse me. If you're watching this on video, if you're listening to this on a podcast, drop a note, drop a rating, but whatever it is, please take a moment to give us your feedback about this episode. It helps us a lot. So please take a moment and do that. All right, you guys. But we're coming to the end anyway. So thank you again for joining me on Hot Topics, and I look forward to you joining me at the next episode. Thank you guys, and I'm signing off. Bye.